Now we have all speakers also present, and welcome to everybody. So this 7th webinar, and as you know, we have this activity that we think about as this governance development forum, and an activity to enable stakeholders to contribute to governance development and a platform for information, dialogue and development. And I've repeated this now several times for some of you that have been seen a number of these webinars or participated in a number of them, and you can follow the work on this website that we announce here. Today we will present the draft governance framework. We have a deliverable in this EOSCpilot project where we by this month is producing providing a draft governance framework. And I will leave the word directly to Matthew Dowie, who is the main author of this or coordinating the work here on this topic, to present this in the forthcoming slides here. Are you ready, Matthew?
I am, yes.
Okay. Here we go then.
Okay. So the project, as many of you will know, is looking at the broad range of EOSC and trying to define what it will do, how it will be governed, and the key is that it will be co-developed, co-designed with all stakeholders to adopt an open approach to scientific research. So next slide. Our vision for the governance is that it needs to be fairly lightweight. It shouldn't be a strict hierarchical model, but it needs to support the definition, the management and coordination of all the EOSC components and providers. It needs to define the organizational, operational and managerial interoperability. So how different organizations will work together, how the different operations and services need to work together, and how the different management of these services and resources. Whilst recognizing that EOSC will be dynamic, it will need to evolve, it need to adapt, it will need to be agile. We need to take into account that this is a complex and rich environment. There's a variety of different stakeholders with different needs. There's a variety of heterogeneous services, technologies, resources, and it needs to operate across organizational, community, national and international borders. And ultimately, the guiding principles underpinning EOSC are openness, transparency, inclusion, and it should be an enabler for research, not a barrier. Next slide, please. This is the development forum. The Governance Development Forum is part of Work Package 2 in the EOSCpilot, which is aimed at the governance development. The key activities here, scoping the broad range of stakeholders, ensuring we engage with as many stakeholders and certainly with all the different categories of stakeholders. Developing the governance framework. I'll present what will be our initial draft framework. This is intended as a discussion document, which we will then engage with over the course of the rest of the project through a piloting process to get feedback, to refine it, to modify it, etc. Or then the third aspect of the governance work package is to look at the business models underpinning the funding and sustainability of the EOSC. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, one of the key things for the EOSCpilot is to engage with a broad range of stakeholders, and we've classified the stakeholders into these 8 different groups. Research producing organizations, e-infrastructures, VREs, and other relevant H2020 and potentially FP9 projects as we move forward. Enterprise and commercial SMEs, the general public, particularly in terms of open science, citizen science, national, regional, and local government agencies, as these will be defining some of the research agendas and also providing some of the policy frameworks and some of the funding and strategy. Research funding bodies, as again, they're to be defining research strategies and funding. Research infrastructures, learned societies, research communities, scientific and professional associations, service providers, both in the public sector and the private sector, and last and certainly not least, academic institutions and research libraries. Next slide, please. So in the consultation that we've had to date, through these forums, through various workshops and events and other presentations and feedback, a variety of things. It should involve everybody, so no massive ambition there. Despite involving everybody, it needs to be as simple, as flexible as possible. Not necessarily create a new legal structure, but build upon what's already there. So we have the interesting balance of include everybody, but be simple. A layered governance framework, but the importance that there is interoperability and discourse between the different layers. A recognition that we have stakeholders performing different roles, and a particular stakeholder may crop up in the same stakeholder may crop up in different roles in the different layers. We have been looking at the European interoperability framework and the digital governance ecosystem of the internet as exemplars and templates to borrow best practice from. It is important to involve the member states, associated countries, and other national players in the governance and decision making. And we've also had feedback about the unclear relationship between the governance model in the EOS declaration and the governance framework. And hopefully we can clarify how the two different views are really different views of the same structure. So we're building on the interoperability framework. We have just explored different options for the EOS core resources delivery model. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, including one which doesn't foresee any new legal structure or organization. I will cover how the EOS declaration and what is described here fit together. And we're looking at community governance models to ensure that stakeholder drive the development of the EOSC. So next slide. So we have 3 stakeholder roles. So we've taken those 10 different stakeholders and we've looked at them, and we've looked at the different roles that they can provide in the EOS governance. And we see there are 3 principal roles. Those of consumers who will consume services. So they are the end users of services, data, and other resources provided by EOSC. We also see providers who provide the services, the resources, etc. into EOSC. In many cases, we see that, as you can see from here, there are different stakeholders who crop up in both. And so there will be examples of intermediaries who are both a consumer and a provider of services from and into EOSC. And then there's strategic, those involved in the strategic director compliance and funding of EOSC. And the other thing I will point about this slide is the list of stakeholders in these are meant to be examples, and they're not meant to be comprehensive or exhaustive. So just because you feel that you're a stakeholder and you're not in the right role doesn't mean you're excluded from that role. These are just to give a flavor of the types of stakeholders in the role, but it is all inclusive. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things we've looked at is different governance models, and we've taken this community governance model, which is used mainly in the public sector and in social engagement. And broadly speaking, it specifies that there are three main areas in engaging with citizens and social projects. First of all, engaging with them and determining what they actually want and need. Having done that, there's the actually doing stuff. And then you need to check whether what you're doing actually does meet the needs you identified with the citizens in the first place. So there's a virtuous circle of determining what the needs are, doing something and checking it met the needs, which is illustrated in this diagram here. And of course, the key areas are in the overlaps. Now, what we felt with this diagram is if for citizens you substituted researchers, and for getting things done you substituted the EOSC, it maps quite neatly onto the different circles in the EOSC declaration in terms of institutional funders, governance board, and the stakeholders forum. So if we go on to the next slide. Oh, okay, that just allows you to see around the back. In the EOSC declaration, in the section on governance, it mentions these three layers: institutional, executive, operational, and advisory. Now, if you can click, please, Per. So the top layer we regard as the strategic, which is about ensuring that the needs are met. Then in the next layer, another click, please. The executive is very much maps onto that getting things done and actually providing, showing that EOSC does meet the needs. And then we have advisory, which we believe is the steering layer. This is to engage the community. And the reason I believe it's steering rather than advisory is that these are the requirements. These are what needs to be met. This drives the whole cycle. So this determines what the community wants. The strategic then signs off on that and authorizes the executive to do it. And then there's a report back around the other way to check that it's actually meeting their results. So if we go on to the next slide. So that's captured in this diagram. So we have the stakeholders, which I've unashamedly put at the top, steering the whole process. We then have the strategic and executive. And the way the overlaps work, so as I say, steering defines the requirements, best practices, principles of engagement, standards, etc. The strategic then defines what are the objectives, what does EOSC have to do, and also some metrics to check those objectives. The executive then actually commissions resources in EOSC, funds EOSC, and so forth, and it then checks that the performance of EOSC actually meets the needs. And then we go around the circle. And then if we click once more, in the middle, that's where EOSC sits. And that hopefully leads us onto the next slide, please. So our resource model, and from now on, I will talk of EOS resources rather than services to capture that it's not just technical services, it's some of the knowledge services, the support services, the training. It's not just services, it's data, etc. So resources to capture that broad range of what we're talking about. EOSC, the key component services within EOSC will be compliant. They will be compliant with the principles of engagement determined by the stakeholder forum. They will be technically compatible with the EOSC architecture. Then there will be other services which are technically compatible but may not fully be compliant with the EOSC principles of engagement. That might be because they're for a particular community or scientific community within EOSC, and so the broad principles of engagement don't apply. It might be that they're still under development and they haven't fully supported EOSC yet, so we'll move across. So those are compatible, sort of on the border between external and EOSC. And then we have external services, all of the other services out there on the internet, which researchers obviously are free to use. And then we also have within those categories, core services, things like the EOS portal, the service catalog, etc., which are the foundation of EOSC and will need to be supported centrally by EOSC. Then we have other EOSC services which will be supported via, this is where what we're exploring in the business models, how they will be funded. Will it be via the various vehicles in the framework program for cost recovery of services given which are delivered to the research community? Will it be a cloud coin or other micropayment system, etc.? That's future work. And then there are other services which might be part of EOSC but have their own other funding stream. Maybe they're funded at a national level or by research infrastructure, etc. Okay, next slide, please. So this is really how it then all fits together. We have the steering layer with the stakeholder forum, where consumers and providers will intermingle and determine the scientific case, the requirements, the technology requirements, the policies, principles of engagements, and so forth. The strategic layer, which is where the national bodies will sit to determine, based on the feedback from the steering, what services are needed, what new services are needed, etc., will set objectives and metrics and with give the executive the authority to actually subsidize services, incentivize services, resources, and compensate resources as required. And then there's a loop going the other way around in that the EOSC will actually provide the services to the communities, the stakeholders. They will report back how well that is meeting their needs to the executive, who will report back to the strategic layer, and action will be taken accordingly. Okay, if we move on, please. So the stakeholder forum, this is an area that we need to develop with the community. We need to co-design how the stakeholder forums will work, how the consumers and the providers will work together. There are various models from RDA in our own area, WISE in the security area for e-infrastructures. There's examples from the internet governance in terms of W3C, OASIS, IETF, etc., of how we can build this. In general, most of these organizations will have some oversight board. Underneath that, thematic areas, which does some prioritization, and then underneath that, working groups who will actually do the work, determine the standards, the requirements, etc., and birds of a feather for ensuring that the it doesn't stale, and new ideas and innovations can be discussed and bubble up. One of the key things is that working groups will typically be time-based and would actually need to deliver, and the layers above are there just to make sure that those working groups have principles and policies in terms of how they work, and also to ensure that there's not a working group that is just lying fallow and not delivering, and to close off working groups that are clearly in dead ends. So that's sort of a broad oversight of how it might look, but this is one of the activities that we want to co-design, co-develop with the community, with the stakeholders. And the first activity here will be the session at the Stakeholder Forum at the end of the month in Brussels. So on the second day, we have a session on SHAPE, the Advisory Stakeholder Forum. We may have to change that to the Steering Stakeholder Forum. And so we'd encourage you to attend that and participate there. So if we move on to the next slide. Next steps. As I say, we need to co-design the stakeholder forums with the stakeholders, and that will be an activity over the next part of the project. We are developing the business models to enable the executive to actually deliver EOSC, and that, I believe, is the topic for the next governance forum webinar in December. There is activity underway in the project on the principles of engagement and the policy framework, which we haven't included in the current draft because that work is still under development, but that is something we will bring in over the course of the next few months. And the key activity under which is piloting the governance framework is to take the Strawman, the draft we have now, and to discuss that with the community over the course of the next 6 to 12 months and develop that and build upon that work. So final slide. So these are ways to get involved. There's the next Governance Development Forum webinar in December, which, as I said, is concentrating on business models. We have a plenary event in at the end of November. We have various thematic workshops as part of the governance piloting activity, including one which is to coincide at the EUDAT conference. You can find more information on the EOSCpilot website, and in particular, there's a link in the slide for the governance framework work, and also a link where you can register your interest in the project, the areas you're interested in, and can receive updates and invitations to future events and webinars across the whole range of the project, not just the governance framework. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody.